Just before 1 a.m. in the early hours of June 14th, 2007, an event was about to take place that would change London forever. As residents slept, one of the worst fires in UK history was brewing, climbing 19 floors in less than 12 minutes and shattering lives both in the UK and further afield. But when the emergency services received a call from a man named Bahalu Kabidi, they likely would have never anticipated just what was about to happen. What went from a suspected fire inside of one flat turned into the deadliest blaze in decades. 72 lives were lost that day, and as the fire continued to fill London's skies with smoke, many people started to ask, how could this have happened? Greed, corporate dishonesty, failed historical warnings, and appalling health and safety measures would all play a factor in this disaster. Once the fire stopped, the nightmare was far from over. Today we're going to talk about some of the people that claimed to have been inside or to have lost loved ones inside of Grenfell Tower, only to be proven as liars. The man who saw his life torn apart and was offered witness protection due to the media somewhat blaming him. The systematic failures that had to be admitted, investigated, and solved in the aftermath, as well as telling you guys what actually happened that tragic day. This is the story of Grenfell Tower.
Before we get into this episode, I just want to say that this is one of the most distressing cases that we've covered on this channel. And of course, we will always try to cover this story with the respect that it deserves. The Grenfell Tower fire claimed the lives of 72 innocent people, including 18 children. And our thoughts go out to everyone that has been associated with this horrific tragedy. In the description, we'll be leaving a link to the Grenfell Foundation. This was a charity set up to provide long-term support to survivors, bereaved families, and the wider Grenfell community while helping to preserve the disaster's legacy. So we urge you to support their fundraising efforts if you're able to. Thank you as always for watching another episode of Joey and Josh. Now let me tell you first about the history of the tower. To do that, we have to go all the way back to 1967. This was an era in which World War II had finished, and we were trying to build as many homes as possible because, as you'll remember, a lot of homes were demolished and destroyed during wartime. And so an architectural firm called Clifford, Weirden and Associates started to design a tower block, and it was meant to be for modern social housing. And it was designed in the style of brutalism, which is large concrete blocks, which was very much in style at the time that it was made. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea approved the construction in 1970, and they finally started building the tower in 1972. And by 1974, the building was complete. And at the time, it was said to be a very strong construction and to be very structurally sound in general. And it was designed to last over 100 years from when it was first made. And in the design, there was a rationale called compartmentalization. What this meant in practice is that there were concrete walls combined with self-closing fire doors, which would contain a fire within an individual flat. And they did that for as long as they needed to for the fires to then try and extinguish it, which meant that it wouldn't spread to other areas of the building. As a result of this plan by the designers, a full-scale sort of building-wide evacuation plan was never devised. It was never implemented within the building itself. So what this meant is that the tower had just one narrow staircase as an emergency exit that all of the residents had to use in the event of a fire or similar emergency. And indeed, there was no resident-facing alarm system to actually identify fires. And the tower had 120 flats when it was built, with the bottom 4 stories being reserved for community and office spaces. And the original residents were all working class tenants. And by 2017, over 600 people lived in Grenfell. But the thing was, while this block was meant to last 100 years, what the designers don't necessarily consider is how things advance, how technologies progress, and how people live in these buildings during that time. Because what became clear in the years after the building's construction is that the residents' health and welfare was certainly not considered. And this manifested itself in several controversies and warnings that were never heeded by the people in charge. And that ultimately is the tragedy of this story. So Joey, what I'm going to do is go one by one on all of the warnings that were actually told to the people in charge. And what I've not been able to do is go through every single one of these warnings because there were so many. Quite frankly, if I'd done so, we would be here for hours going through them. So what I've done is selected the most egregious warnings, the most obvious ones. And what I'm going to do now is tell you all about those. Let's first start with a shift in how the building's maintenance was run. Because during the first 20 years of the building's existence, the maintenance and repairs were controlled by the council. In essence, they were directly elected by their constituents and therefore had control over how the building was run. It's important to say here that this was one organisation with oversight. But in 1996, the management shifted and passed on to a new organisation called the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, which we're going to refer to for the rest of the episode as the KCTM. They told residents that this was going to be tenant-led. In other words, they would have a say and control on how the block was being looked after, but in practice, it just made the whole system way more bureaucratic and way slower. And it also meant that repair contracts went between this new organisation and the council. So many different instances of things that needed to be fixed weren't, and there was often several key things that slipped through the cracks. And by all accounts, the relationship between the tenants and those meant to help them quickly deteriorated, which meant even less support was given to those that really needed it. And then there was a huge fire in Scotland that completely changed the way that the government looked at cladding around these tower blocks. In June 1999, the panels of the outside of a block in Irvine, Scotland, called Garnock Court, caught fire. The blaze rose vertically at a rapid rate, and within 15 minutes, the exterior of the building was completely destroyed. Soon after that, the Scottish government quickly tightened their laws on what cladding could be used on Scottish properties, but the English government did not hear that warning, and they changed nothing about how buildings needed to be looked after. And then in 2001, more warnings were given to the government, and again, they did the same thing. They didn't listen to any of those warnings. And that's because there was a government-backed organisation called the Building Research Establishment, and they carried out a large-scale fire test on cladding systems incorporating aluminium composite panels with unmodified polyethylene cores. And this was just like the cladding that was on Grenfell. Now, during these tests, this cladding failed completely. It was a catastrophic failure. They were deemed to be exceptionally dangerous. But the problem was that these materials were not banned and they were not removed retroactively, but they also remained in use and in circulations for new buildings even after these findings. And again, the government saw with their own eyes the findings of these tests, and they did nothing to support the community and the public when they had seen it. But it wasn't just the government that knew how bad the cladding was. In fact, the makers and the manufacturers of this cladding also knew how dangerous it was. In 2005, a firm called Arconic realized that their specific cassette-style panels performed disastrously in fire tests. And in 2007, there was an internal email by an exec called Claude Werhel saying that if their cladding set alight, it could kill tens of people. Irregardless of this, firms like Arconic, Celotex, and Kingspan continued to produce cladding and in fact even tried to reduce their costs at more detriment to public safety. And even with all of these warnings, even though the government had a full idea of how dangerous the cladding was, even though the manufacturers not only knew how dangerous it was, but actually cut costs and made it even more dangerous, fires still continued to burn. And in fact, in 2010, there was a fire at Grenfell. The fire broke out in a lift lobby on floor 6 of Grenfell Tower. Smoke leaked into the lobbies of floor 7, 12, 13, 15, 17, 18, 19, and 20, trapping residents on all of those floors. People couldn't even escape from their own building. They weren't able to use the fire exits. And still, even after this, nothing was done about Grenfell. The incident proved that the building's passive fire safety systems and extraction ventilation had completely collapsed. And in March 2014, the London Fire Brigade issued a formal deficiency notice to the KCTMO because of the smoke ventilation system total failure. But it gets worse, Joey, because not only did they not fix the safety systems in Grenfell, they waited 6 years to do any repairs at all. The KCTMO saw this whole event, the fact that they'd left it for so long, as a complete inconvenience, and they didn't seem to care about the fire safety of the building at all. And get this right, there was a fire assessor called Carl Stokes. He was responsible for signing off Grenfell and stating that it was safe for residents during this period. Not only, Joey, did he not do his job, but he actually made up some of his qualifications, and he was no way qualified to operate in a building of this size.
This is mad because we haven't even got to the night in question that we're going to speak about. But on every single level so far, you're showing me failures, whether it be from the government, whether it be from the people that built Grenfell Tower. And in one of the most tragic ways, it's such an ominous prelude as to what actually happened that night, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And look, mate, it just continues to get worse and worse, because the next point we have to go to is 2011, because the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation replaced Grenfell's wooden flat entrance doors with plastic composite ones. And guess what? When they did so, they failed to stipulate to the manufacturer the fire safety resistance needed for those doors and how they were going to be used, i.e. the system needed to have the self-closed doors to be able to isolate the flats and make sure that fire didn't spread. So not only did they have complete inaction for 6 years trying to fix a previous fire, even when they were doing work to the property, even when they were replacing the doors, they were actually making the system more dangerous. Right, before we get into that, Joey, I know that you have had car finance in the past, and you told me that you think you could get some money back from that car finance.
I've been told by a few people that I could get money back. I'm hoping I can.
And well, I have got some great news for you, Joey, because if you work with Refund Club, the sponsor of this video, you might be able to do just that. Because if you had a car finance agreement between 2007 and 2021, there was a huge amount of mis-selling of these car finance agreements, which means you could be entitled for some cash. And it's estimated that around £8.2 billion could be owed back to over 14 million UK drivers. And the best part of this is that you can conduct a free check. All you need to do is hit the link in the description, go onto the website and put your name and date of birth, and you could find out if you might be due a claim and a bit of cash from these car finance refunds. And the beauty of Refund Club is that yes, you could do this completely by yourself, but it takes ages. And let's be honest, in the modern era where we're super busy, we just want something that's done really quickly, and you can start the process in under 60 seconds. They'll then find all of your previous agreements, check whether you have a valid claim, and if you do, it will be passed over to their in-house legal team, and it's all on a no-win, no-fee basis, so you only pay for a claim if it's successful. And something that is worth knowing is that if you've had multiple car finance agreements in that period of time, remember it's 2007 to 2021, you can actually claim multiple times and get refunds on some of that cash. And the FCA estimates that an average successful claim could be about £829 per agreement. So it is definitely worth your time just to have a look and a check. And you'll be in good hands because Refund Club has an excellent rating on Trustpilot. So you know you're going to be working with people that are going to be looking after you. So check out Refund Club using the link in the description or the QR code on screen, and let us know in the comments if you are able to claim any cash back. Now let's get back to the episode. And in 2013, the residents of Grenfell were not only ignored already waiting for 6 years, but they were increasingly exasperated by their treatment. The Grenfell Action Group, set up by the residents of the block, published a report that said firefighting equipment had gone unchecked for 4 years. Extinguishers had expired, and some even had condemned written on them. And what is clear is that fire assessors were not doing their job in assessing the safety of Grenfell. And rather than listening to their concerns, the council actually threatened a blogger from the Grenfell Action Group with legal action for defamation and harassment. The KCTMO also threatened residents Mariam El-Ghwari and Nadiam Choukair with defamation lawsuits for campaigning for better fire safety. Yes, they even threatened them with legal action for stating that they were unsafe in their own homes. It is absolutely abhorrent stuff by both the council and also this management company that was set up in between the council and the tenants. But in 2014 and 2015, the residents thought they finally had a breakthrough because the management company actually started to swap out the cladding. But the thing is, the management company is incentivized to save as much money as possible because it lines their purses if they do. And so what they did is they chose a core for this new cladding that was basically what they've described as solid petrol. It is incredibly dangerous and it would never, ever be allowed now. The swap saved the KCTMO £2 per square metre, which was just £5,000 for the entire building. And it then created a 50mm air gap between the cladding and the insulation, which operated as a chimney if any fire source was anywhere near. Again, the KCTMO completely disregarded people's safety to save a very small amount of money in the grand scheme of things. And in November 2016, the Grenfell Action Group provided what they thought was the final warning on how dangerous the properties actually were. Edward Defan co-authored an online blog titled KCTMO Playing with Fire. The post warned that corridors were blocked with old mattresses and that the building had one single exit staircase. The group itself also wrote that it is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the KCTMO. We predict that it won't be long before the words of this blog come back to haunt the KCTMO management. They can't say they haven't been warned. And this very much was the final warning. The residents of Grenfell had done everything they possibly could to say to the government, the council, the management company that this place was incredibly dangerous. And next came the fire that changed London and the UK forever. And that happened on Wednesday, the 14th of June, 2017.
Yeah, so just before 1 a.m, the emergency services receive a call from a man named Bahailu Kabede. He tells them that there's a fire in his kitchen inside Grenfell Tower, and it's actually believed that this fire came from a faulty hotpoint fridge freezer. Now, he lives in flat 16 on the 4th floor. He's got two other residents living in the same flat with him, and he quickly alerts them as soon as he wakes and smells the smoke. He actually darts out into the hallway of the building and starts knocking on multiple doors. He's trying to wake as many residents up as he can, but ultimately the smoke becomes too thick. It starts to get to a point where it's seriously harming them, and they have to evacuate the building. Now, when Bahailu actually does this, he is still, I believe, in sort of nightwear, slippers. He's not even had time to be able to get any possessions or get dressed, and he actually heads out the front of the building with just his mobile phone. Within a couple of minutes, the emergency services arrive, including both fire engines and ambulances, and within a few more minutes after that, pretty much most of the people that would actually survive the blaze were already outside of the flats. And what they see horrifies them, as the fire has actually spread all along the sides of the tower. And what was unknown at this time was that the highly flammable cladding was actually responsible for the spread. And what's worse is that the firefighters on the ground didn't actually realise that the cladding was responsible. And therefore, when they're sort of giving time frames and they're working out methods of how to put the blaze out, they haven't taken that into account. They're completely unaware that this fire is worse than they realise, and it's spreading quicker than they realise. Crucially, the advice to stay put was actually given to multiple residents. Residents that, had they have not received that advice, may well have tried their hand at an escape, at survival. And you hear so many stories of the residents that did, even some residents that were told to stay put, and they were able to survive by going against that advice. And eventually, 2 hours after they were first told that, the firefighters and the services on the ground would go against that advice themselves, and and that's when they would eventually tell residents to try and evacuate the building, a building that had become a lot more difficult to evacuate by that time. And the heartbreaking thing about this is so many of the residents that were left in the building and were told to stay put were either disabled, immobile, and a lot of them were very, very young. Not only that, the methods of exit weren't easy at all. Multiple lifts had basically stopped working because of the fire, and also multiple fire exits just weren't in use. For some reason, the lines of communication between the fire service and emergency services were not as good as they needed to be on that night. And that meant that when the emergency services were taking phone calls from residents trapped inside of the building, they hadn't communicated properly with the fire services. A lot of the firefighters on the ground didn't actually realize that there were multiple residents that they still needed to try and rescue and that were trying their hand at escaping. As I previously mentioned, it was 2 hours roughly before the residents were issued the opposite advice to the original stay put guidelines. And during that time, the fire had both reached and wrapped around the top of the building, filling the lift spaces and burning the inside of many flats. 999 operators were being overwhelmed by calls from people still trapped inside the flats that needed rescuing, but they are now told to evacuate immediately. Burning debris starts falling from the building, and that means that even more fires were having to be put out on the ground. It means that the fire services were being stretched even further than they already clearly were. And by 3:20 a.m., the entire building is inflamed. Firefighters at this point on the ground understand that in their estimations, there's roughly 100 people in the building still, many of which would never be able to be saved. The last person to actually be rescued from Grenfell Tower was at just after 8 a.m., a man named Elpidio Bonifacio, and this actually meant that he had been stuck inside of a burning building for over 7 hours at this point. By 10 a.m., many people trying to help had arrived with first aid, food, water, and blankets, and by 12 p.m., the first death toll is confirmed. They confirmed that 6 people have died, but the public are warned that many residents are missing, and therefore this toll was likely to rise significantly. And within an hour, that number had jumped by another 6, with now 12 people confirmed to be dead. 20 more were said to be in critical condition. By 5 p.m., the actual media attention had pivoted towards what had started the fire, and this was pretty much when we heard the first news, as those of us who didn't know anything about the redevelopments of Grenfell Tower, that kind of started to point suspicion at the cladding. But it is worth noting that at this point, no one still actually knows what has happened. And therefore, many people were still raising suspicion and pointing the finger almost at the flat that the fire had started in. The following day, while the building is still on fire, then Prime Minister Theresa May announces that there will be an inquiry into what's gone on here. And it's not actually until the following day, almost 60 hours after the blaze started, that the fire is officially put out. Not long after that, we learned of the final death toll. And like we suggested, it was much higher than what was originally put out. 72 lives were confirmed to be lost in that tragic fire. And as heartbreaking as it is for even one life to be lost by this tragic event, it's absolutely horrible to learn that 18 children had their lives taken by this fire. Lena Belkadi was just 6 months old when she lost her life. Her sister also passed away later on in the hospital after complications caused by the fire. There was a woman called Andrea Gomez who was actually pregnant at the time of the fire, and although she managed to escape from the building, her unborn son Logan tragically passed away as a result of complications from the smoke inhalation. A man named Mohammed Nader tragically fell to his death from the top of Grenfell Tower, and this was after he had become trapped inside the building while he was heroically trying to save the life of a disabled victim. And I will put another trigger warning here because we are about to go into some of the tragic details around the people that lost their lives in Grenfell Tower. The Shuker family had 6 members pass away inside of Grenfell Tower. 3 generations of their family passed away after being trapped on the 22nd floor of the building. They were one of multiple families who actually lost multiple family members after they were trapped above the 20th floor of Grenfell Tower. There was a 31-year-old woman called Raina Ibrahim. She actually started a Facebook live stream video at the time that she was trapped inside of the burning tower. And it's honestly one of the most tragic things that you could possibly watch. She's comforting her 2 young daughters. And not long after the live stream going up, the camera cut to black. And in the days after, we learned that Raina and her 2 daughters were also victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. And obviously, I haven't gone into all 72 of the lives that were tragically lost that day. But you can see, even speaking about it now, how hard this is to talk about. As a parent, it's the worst possible fate. It's the worst way that anyone could go. And it's really, really hard to talk about.
And our thoughts, of course, go out to every single victim of this tragedy, as well as their loved ones and friends whose lives will be changed forever. And what happened next was a collective state of trauma and disbelief about what happened at Grenfell. One local volunteer after the tragedy said that up to 20 people in North Kensington had tried to self-delete because of the events at Grenfell. And as you can imagine, the psychological toll on the survivors, on the firefighters, on the first aid givers, on the paramedics, of the people in hospital was immense. And the council was completely unprepared for events like this. And it wasn't even until 6 a.m. that they opened an emergency centre to help those victims, which meant that many displaced and traumatized residents were left to wander the streets with no guidance on what to do. And by 10:30 a.m., not a single representative from the council went to what they call rest centres, which is where victims can actually go and get support, get food, get water, because the houses had been destroyed. And instead of the council, it was the local community that were actually there helping victims and survivors. And it was them that were doing all of the work of the state. And the community absolutely responded when they needed to. They helped secure food, water, and clothing for the people that needed it most. And nearby football clubs, including QPR, opened their stadiums up to support the people that needed it. And what this event showed was the clear disparity of wealth in London. Because did you know, Joey, that Kensington and Chelsea is one of the wealthiest local authorities in the entire country?
Yep. Yeah, I did know that.
So they're very well off, and they've actually got a stockpile of over £274 million in their financial reserves. So what you could obviously hope that they do as a result of that is support the victims and give them some aid and make sure that they're looked after, give them shelter, money to be able to support themselves in the short term, while the property that they gave them, council house, social housing, was actually destroyed and not able to stay there. Now, what was if I told you that instead of doing that, they gave them a £10 voucher to be able to buy food?
The council gave them that.
The council gave them £10.
That's ridiculous.
Straight after this horrific tragedy. So again, the council's failures were not just after this and what we're going to describe in the inquiry, but in the immediate aftermath as well. They had no compassion. They had no ability to look after people, and they were greedy. And also, like, I think there was an argument, and a very clear argument, this is correct, that there's institutional racism, there's classism involved in this, because the people that were running the council were obviously looking about, you know, the wealthy areas of Kensington and Chelsea, which, as we know, is a very wealthy area, but they weren't looking after the people that actually lived there. And what I found the most disgusting aspect of what the council was doing here was that even in the months after this, there were several people's rent that was actually claimed via direct debits, even though they weren't able to stay in their own homes.
How does that work? How can anyone in an office, council building somewhere not understand that that payment is coming out from someone who is living inside Grenfell Tower, a tower that has burnt down tragically? And a lot of the people that lived there and a lot of people that viewed this case would hold a certain level of responsibility at the council's door for.
Just stop the direct debits. It is literally a job where you go through a spreadsheet and you stop the direct debits. It is not a complicated job, and it really proved the incompetence of the council.
Yeah, and this was in the immediate aftermath, wasn't it? We're talking the day,
hours
after the tragedy, because what actually happened was Kensington and Chelsea council council realised exactly probably what the public backlash could be as well. And they did start to distribute money to help with survivors and victims. But there were some major controversies with that, which we are about to go into.
Before we do that, Joe, let me just tell you about the political fallout that happened straight after this, because it was vast, but potentially not as vast as it should have been. Because Nicholas Holgate, the chief executive of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, was asked to leave his position on the 21st of June. The fact that this took a week and the guy didn't resign from his position is another travesty involved in this case. The guy presided over what is a complete and utter failure, and it took him 7 days to even get the call to resign. He didn't have the balls to do it himself. Absolute disgrace. And another fact that I didn't really understand is, if he's in charge of a council, why is he called a chief executive? A council's not, elected positions where you have a head councillor as opposed to a chief executive. It just sounds really weird. Like, what is going on in Kensington and Chelsea where you have to be run like a business? Like, this is meant to be a public organisation for the benefit of the public, not a chief executive running a company. It feels very strange. But he wasn't the only person that had to leave their job. Nicholas Paget Brown, the Conservative leader of that council, resigned on the 30th of June amid intense pressure. And the council was so inept at this point that they weren't even given the task of actually managing the crisis at this point. This went to the Grenfell fire response team, led by the City of London Corporation and a man called John Barradell. And the pressure and the scrutiny continued all the way to the very top, because the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, succumbed to a lot of scrutiny. She actually visited the tower on the day of the fire, but did so in private. She didn't meet a single survivor from the tragedy. And she then went on to, later in the day, do an interview on Newsnight, which was highly criticised by the public. When Theresa May finally did visit St Clement's Church to meet some of the victims, she was heckled by angry crowds shouting "coward," "murderer," and "shame on you." Realising the depth of the state's failure, Theresa May actually went into the House of Commons on June the 21st, stating, "There has been a failure of the state, local and national, to help people when they needed it most. As Prime Minister, I apologise for that failure." To establish the truth of what happened and to ultimately find who was responsible for this event, Theresa May went on to announce that there would be a public inquiry to find out what happened. The inquiry was structured into two distinct phases to establish first what happened and then why. Phase 1 happened between June 2018 and October 2019, and that focused on the night of the fire, the spread of the flames, and the immediate emergency services response. The second phase was between January 2020 and September 2024, which focused on the decades of systemic failures, the 2015 and 16 refurbishment, the product testing, the marketing fraud, and the government oversight. The problem was, before the inquiry even started, people had suggested that there was flaws with it. Survive suggested that there would be racial discrimination as part of this inquiry. And in January 2018, the inquiry was forced to drop its appointed auditor, KPMG, because they had a conflict of interest as they worked with the council and several of the private firms responsible for the cladding. So phase 1 started in June 2018. At the start, there were 7 days of harrowing, deeply moving commemoration hearings at the Millennium Gloucester Hotel in Kensington, honouring the individual stories of all of the victims. Over the following months, the inquiry heard evidence from survivors, experts and firefighters, including survivors like Nicholas Burton, who described escaping through choking, zero visibility smoke on the 19th floor, while others recounted the horror of receiving 999 calls from trapped relatives who had been told by operators to stay put. But what annoyed the most people about phase 1 was when Fire Brigade Commissioner Danny Cotton started to give her evidence. She suggested that the London Fire Brigade did nothing wrong in the way that they treated this event. She said that the cladding fire was an unprecedented event akin to a space shuttle landing on the Shard. And of course, we absolutely respect the work of firefighters. They have one of the toughest jobs in the world and they often put their own lives at risk. But what is the commissioner here talking about. It's absolute rubbish. So the findings of phase 1 were a damning indictment of both the building's physical structure and the fire brigade's operational response. They suggested that the cladding of the building operated as a fuel, and the way that it had been built basically worked as a chimney. And then the inquiry praised the individual bravery of the rank and file firefighters, but severely criticised the London Fire Brigade's institutional preparation or lack thereof. Indeed, commanders had received no training on cladding fires or knew how to recognise a total failure of compartmentation. They also strongly criticised the stay put order, which meant that so many people stayed in the building when they didn't need to. Following the blistering critique of her leadership, Danny Cotton resigned early from her post in December 2019. But then it came to phase 2 of the inquiry. And this was all about who was to blame systemically for all of the failures throughout the years that we described at the start of this episode. And this hearing started with immediate obstruction. People that worked for the private contractors, for the manufacturers of the cladding, and for the council didn't want to testify because they were worried about criminal proceedings coming down the line. So they effectively had to sign an order which meant that they wouldn't be due for criminal trial if they testified at the inquiry. And by the way, they absolutely should have been involved in criminal trials because of the negligence that went on here. So when the evidence actually finally flowed, the inquiry's lead counsel, Richard Millant KC, laid bare a terrifying merry-go-round of buck passing where every single organisation involved in the refurbishment blamed someone else and no one took ownership of their actions. Ultimately, it was deemed that 4 key parties played a role in the negligence. First, it was the product manufacturers, and second, it was the testing authorities. Third, it was the government, and fourth was the council. So let's start with the manufacturers. The inquiry uncovered jaw-dropping evidence of corporate wrongdoing. Arconic, the manufacturers of the cladding panels, had known since 2005 that its product performed disastrously in fire tests, and the company deliberately hid the test data to protect its market share, refusing to withdraw the product due to the cost of doing so. And both Silotex and Kingspan also didn't inform the public of their cladding issues. And then it was the turn of the testing bodies. Well, the building research establishment was meant to be independent, but what the inquiry found is that they were complicit in the manufacturers hiding information from the public. They sacrificed their scientific integrity because they wanted to continue the contract with their paying clients. Now, who, Joey, do you think were paying the testers to make sure their cladding was safe for public use?
Was it the council?
No, it was the manufacturers that obviously had a commercial interest in selling their cladding that were paying the testing authorities. So what a surprise that they wanted to make sure that their clients were looked after and their cladding was deemed safe. It is a complete farce. Then for the government, it was found that they consistently wanted to deregulate and make sure that the cladding companies were able to continue their business. The Department for Communities and Local Government viewed safety regulations as burdens on business, and Stephen Williams MP, a junior minister, had explicitly dismissed warnings from the all-party parliamentary group about cladding disasters, writing that he was not willing to disrupt the work of the department, so the cladding companies continued their horrific manufacturing procedures. And then finally for the council, the inquiry suggested that they were also just out for their own benefit and they cared very little for the safety of their residents. And on September the 4th, 2024, Sir Martin Morbrick published the inquiry's final 1,700-page report. The verdict was absolute. The 72 deaths at Grenfell Tower were entirely avoidable.
And as the nation came together in support for those who were affected and those who were involved, something nearly as shocking as the fire itself happened. There proved to be a significant number of people that didn't view this event as a tragedy, but more so viewed it as an opportunity to exploit and make money out of. Some falsely claimed that they had escaped the fire themselves, and some falsely claimed that they had lost family members inside the tower. And although many of these were debunked, many of these people were punished, and many now are still even being looked into, we shouldn't underplay the significance that this had in taking time, resources, and effort away to the real survivors and the real people that were impacted by the fire. So first off, we have to talk about about a disgusting con man called An Ningu Nguyen. He spent 2 whole weeks claiming to have been inside Grenfell Tower that night, where he said he lost his wife and his 12-year-old son. He claimed to have lived on the 15th floor and apparently had done so for over 20 years. He was given emergency cash, food, clothing, a smartphone, and for some reason, 2 laptops, all while being put up in a hotel. He gave emotional interviews as well as being pictured shaking hands with then Prince Charles. He applied for additional emergency funds so that he could fly family over from Hong Kong for his son's apparent funeral. But after giving conflicting flat numbers, listing flats that the building didn't even have, and being investigated, it was revealed that he had not been in Grenfell Tower at all. He didn't have a wife or a son, and he was actually living in Beckenham at the time. He was sent to prison for 21 months. Then you have Joyce Msokiri. She travelled to the scene from Sutton and claimed to have lost her husband in the fire, as well as having a child in intensive care from the fire. And it's estimated that she received around £19,000 worth of handouts. She was granted a 3-month-long stay in a high-end hotel. She was also apparently given high-end dresses, handbags, and electronics. But despite claiming to have lived in the building for over 5 months, she was never able to give officers a flat number in which her and her partner had lived. She was able to recount heroic tales of her and her husband saving children from the fire, but she wasn't able to recount what flat they lived in. And it baffles me that Kensington and Chelsea Council weren't able to debunk this sooner during her month-long stay. But I think, as you alluded to there, they were almost so guilty and ashamed of how badly they had treated survivors in the immediate aftermath that they were really scrambling here. And they weren't checking as thoroughly as they could be. Maybe you could argue that because those checks would have involved spending even more on certain resources. And they actually ended up running her phone records, which when they did, showed that she was nowhere near the tower on the night. She was in Sutton. She was sent down for 4.5 years. Elaine Douglas and Tommy Brooks were 2 more fraudsters who claimed to have been in the building that night, but in fact were nowhere near. However, that didn't stop them receiving funds, which totaled an unbelievable 130,000 approximately. They were put up in a Radisson Blu hotel for over 200 days, where they ran up a really expensive food bill. And they even said that they weren't in the building that night. They said they were staying with friends. However, they claimed to have lived on the 19th floor, and they claimed that their flat was completely destroyed. But when the police eventually look into it, they debunk it. They find out that this 19th floor flat that they're talking about didn't exist, and they were sent to prison for over 3 years. And there are obviously so many more Grenfell Tower fraudsters that claim to have been in the fire, had family members that were lost in the fire, and therefore did so for financial gain and the benefits that it could bring to their lives. And do you know what, Josh, right? How many do you actually think were sent to prison in the aftermath of these fraudulent claims?
To be fair, I'd probably guess, I don't know, 3 or 4 times more than you've actually said.
21 prison sentences
Wow.
were handed out in the aftermath, and 50 more people are still under investigation.
Unbelievable that people could even think about doing that, to be honest.
100%. And what is pretty unbelievable to me is that I'm only giving my perception here, and I don't want this to come across as insensitive to anyone that was a victim or had family members in the tower. But I truly do feel like this is an event that I'm not going to say has been swept under the carpet, but it has been very much moved on from, considering it was less than a decade ago. There's anniversaries every single year, aren't there? And it's not something that I would say you hear all that much about. And therefore, it was something that I was shocked to find out was still under immense amounts of investigation.
Yeah, I was surprised as well, and I totally agree with you. I feel like even though we think about the anniversary every year, even though we, as the public remember this event, and I remember driving past it consistently and still thinking about it and it being in my collective memory, I don't know if it is still a pressing issue for the government, even though they're going through all of these findings, even though now we're going to find some criminal proceedings that are going to go on in 2027, that's starting up. I still don't think the true, I suppose, convictions and the true ramifications from this case are ever really going to be found out. And really what we hope, and I'm glad we've covered it more than anything, right? I'm glad we've talked about it on the episode, because at least we've told the story, and it, you know, it gets in the consciousness of people that are watching this right now for that reason alone. But I don't think the government are necessarily doing the steps they needed to do for the inquiry. I know that a lot of the survivors and residents of Grenfell are still pushing the government to make sure that they implement the changes that they say they're going to. But myself, having lived in a block in London, I know that the leasehold system is broken. I know that the management system of these big flats and these big blocks are completely broken. And the way that they treat people, not just from a fire safety perspective, but just generally from, you know, actually being a tenant in a building, is disgraceful.
100%.
And the whole system needs to be
elderly family.
Yeah.
And I speak about the young and old here as well. Like, I've had elderly family members as well, living in council blocks and stuff like that. Yeah. And in terms of that way that people are treated, like, I think there's such a significant, if any, amount of attention put on some of the residents inside some of these blocks, like little things that aren't little, but may seem it, like lifts being out of order and stuff like that. The actual care and renovations that are put into these blocks, they may be little to someone sitting in an office there who's seeing over dozens and if not more amounts of residential buildings and whatnot. But they're huge things that impact people's lives, and they don't get anywhere near enough attention.
No, they don't. And ultimately, you know, the cynical nature of this, and we have to expose it because it's the truth. Management companies are sucking money away from hardworking people that are just trying to basically put a roof over their heads. And they're consistently not looking after the people that are there. And they're doing so because they want to be profit making. They want to get their own bonuses, and they don't care about people. We're talking about a right for someone to be able to have a house over their head, to be able to be looked after, to be safe. And more often than not, in the current system and the way that the current government is looking after people, that they're not doing it. They're not looking after people. So even though there's been this inquiry, there's been all of these sort of recommendations as a result of the inquiry, I personally feel that not a lot has changed. And I very much hope that the government will grow a backbone and actually start addressing these things for the benefit of their constituents. And I hope that people do vote with their, you know, as they can do, to enact change here, to actually push the government to be able to do things, because that's ultimately, as a citizen, all we can really do. So yeah, look, that was the Grenfell case. We hope that we covered it with the respect that it deserves. Our thoughts very much go out to every single victim, everyone that has been involved in this case, anyone that was in London that had to suffer through it as well, because it was a horrific time that we all really, you know, found tough, to be honest with you, let alone people that were actually there. So our thoughts and prayers go out to all of those people. And we hope by covering this case, we did them justice.
Once again, people, it was a really heavy case to cover, especially with a lot of the details that we had to go into, but it's a story that we really do think needs covering. And if you found today's video interesting, then why not check out our video we did on the 7/7 attacks in London, which is on screen now. Thank you so much to all of you that made it to the end of another video, and we will see you all in the next one.